Heather here with astrologywithheather.com, and I am back with another special video. And today I finally have caught up with the one and only Robert Phoenix. Hi, Robert.
Hey, Heather. It's great to be back with you once again.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And we're going to be covering sort of a big scale topic here, which is going to be the main events, the major, significant astrology for 2020 and what that's going to bring on a more global scale. So I'm really excited about this. And I know everyone's super interested to see what's coming up because we have a lot of intense astrology, even right out the gate, like as soon as 2020 starts.
Yeah, you're referring to the big eclipse, which is happening on the 26th of December. And as you and I are speaking right now, we're already in the eclipse portal, the two and a half week period leading into the eclipse. And one of the things that I've been talking about with this eclipse is that the path of the eclipse is going over Southeast Asia. And we can see that already there's been some very significant seismic activity in that part of the world. There's an island off the coast of New Zealand called White Island, which is a uniquely named island, and they have a volcano there, and it's exploded. And today I was reading that there's about another 60% chance of it exploding again. And some of the firsthand accounts of what's happened to the people on that island are real. It's really hellish. I mean, they've severe burns. There are like 24, 25 people that are still in emergency from the intensity and the burn of that volcano. Mm-hmm. So we can see that this seismic activity has been in motion. It's still continuing to be in motion. And that's just from the sort of the geocosmic perspective. Now, the geopolitical perspective is that this eclipse is going to be essentially moving over Hong Kong, which you and I were talking about before we press record. And the eclipse is going to be taking place right on Hong Kong's midheaven. Mm-hmm. So not only from a physical perspective, but from a quote-unquote metaphysical perspective, this eclipse is hammering right down into Hong Kong, which is already kind of a seething cauldron, a volcano getting set to explode.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have the chart for Hong Kong if you want me to share that.
Yeah, let's put it up there.
Okay. So I pulled up the chart for Hong Kong, which is a chart at midnight, but that's like literally when they switched it from like the British flag symbolically to like the Chinese flag. So this is, I guess, an accurate chart for Hong Kong. And this is actually, I thought was interesting because we were going to discuss this chart for Hong Kong. And when I pulled it up, I noticed that we actually have Jupiter on the midheaven for Hong Kong, literally right now. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, obviously this is a little bit of a more positive energy right now, but it's going to be replaced by something potentially a little bit more turbulent coming into the start of the new year.
Yeah, and Jupiter, even though it's in the sign of Capricorn, we can always look to Jupiter with this idea of expansion. Mm-hmm. And wanting to get bigger, and this idea of freedom and becoming kind of unmoored from local consciousness, which would be Gemini. That's part of the Jupiter experience. But also, when we talk about Jupiter and Capricorn, it also represents government. I mean, Capricorn is government. So when Jupiter comes in on Capricorn and hits the midheaven, what's going to be the net effect of this? Is Hong Kong going to continue to kind of expand and want to shake off the shackles of their communist landlords, or does Jupiter represent more of a presence of the government of their communist landlords? So I think a lot is going to, and it could be both at the same time as well. So there's a lot that's going to get played out here over the next couple of weeks. And I would say, keep your eyes on Hong Kong, because I think it's going to be a story that we're going to be talking about as we hit the eclipse and then after the eclipse going into the new year.
Absolutely. And something else too is that coming into this weekend on the 15th, there's going to be a Uranus trine to Jupiter. And so Uranus will be trining Hong Kong's midheaven. And that's like rebellion, but maybe a more positive expression of that, or a more positive outcome from that expression of rebellion. So, I mean, I feel like, at least for right now, there could be some action taken that could have some more positive results, or we could see some like good news from Hong Kong a little bit in the media. At least that's what I think. I don't know that that's going to last, but for now, it seems like that's what's coming.
Well, certainly there are numbers on the side of people living in Hong Kong, and a lot of the protesters in Hong Kong are people that are roughly under the age of 25. And, we're talking about the Pluto and Sag generation. So if you look at Hong Kong's ninth house, right, you're going to see their Pluto, because Hong Kong was actually created or started with Pluto and Sagittarius. So this is kind of inherent in the story of Hong Kong and the history of Hong Kong, in Hong Kong moving forward. And what we're looking at is sort of the movement of Pluto from the 8th house here, which is behind the scenes, to kind of moving more front and center and occupying that 9th house position, which is going to be more about freedom and expansion. I do tend to think that what we're witnessing here with Hong Kong is not necessarily the result of some kind of organic uprising. I think these things rarely are organic in nature. Whether they're revolutions or civil wars, they tend to be prompted on some level. And with Pluto hanging out there in the 8th house, I can see where that actually might, have some astrological traction in some ways. So it'll certainly be very interesting to watch. I mean, what is the ultimate end game here? Does China walk away from Hong Kong? I mean, let's be clear. China doesn't really need Hong Kong anymore, right? China has become so wealthy and so powerful that places like Shanghai and Macau are actually more important than Hong Kong. Hong Kong was very important to the Chinese during the transition, but they don't really need Hong Kong that much. What does Hong Kong do? Hong Kong doesn't really produce anything, but it was this kind of place where money from the West was being moved in, was being invested. There are other places in the Southeast now, Southeast Asia, Singapore and Indonesia has supplanted Hong Kong. So why is the only reason for China to hang on to Hong Kong is really to save face in a lot of ways. Like, this is a place that they theoretically have some kind of control over, and they don't want anybody else to get any ideas that they could have some kind of uprising or rebellion and just shake off the shackles of their rule. And I think that's kind of where it's at. So China is not going to let go of this situation because they don't want to give anybody else any kind of ideas that, this is the way you do it, right? But at the same time, what do the people in Hong Kong have to live for, fight for, die for? In a lot of ways, nothing, because their future has been kind of predetermined in some ways. So this is a very interesting moment in time, and how it gets resolved, I think, will probably, ripple out and have some kind of global effect. That's my sense here.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course it will have like a global effect. And it makes sense why it's happening with Pluto and Saturn and the South Node in the 10th house of the Hong Kong chart. I mean, that's that oppressive energy and trying to release it, but having to work really hard for it or fight for it in some way. Do you think that with the eclipses coming up, that what do you think will come about? Like, what do you see? Where do you see this?
Well, the Chinese have resisted a lot of really, how do I say this, kind of obvious forms of enforcement. Like the Chinese Central Army has, from what I understand, has infiltrated the Hong Kong police force. So you have people who are soldiers in the Chinese army who are dressed in HK police garb. So that's already kind of happened. So they've been doing things behind the scenes. So the real question is, will China put boots on the ground in Hong Kong? I think that's really where the litmus for all this is going to take place. What's really interesting, too, is that part of this, because this whole thing started in one direction, and then it moved in another direction, because the Chinese actually kind of acceded to some of the demands that the people in Hong Kong had. And then once that happened, it was like, okay, well, we got a new list of demands, a new set of demands. And one of the things that the people of Hong Kong have been very adamant about is things like facial recognition and biometrics. I don't know if you've seen a lot of the protests, but they carry umbrellas so that they won't be identified. And if you look at that 11th house, which tends to be very social, out in the world, group oriented, there's that Neptune-Uranus conjunction in the 11th house, and it's also opposing, Venus and Leo. And if you think about Venus and Leo, it's kind of like it's a fixed sign, but it's also this idea that people can have their relations in a way that are much more personal, right? Leo is a very personal sign, whereas Aquarius is a very impersonal sign. So we're almost seeing like this conflict between Venus and Neptune and the Uranus conjunction. So I think part of what's kind of happening there, and part of this battle has to do with privacy, has to do with biometrics, and it has to do with the people of Hong Kong being able to live their lives in kind of this non-Orwellian fashion in a lot of ways. And I think that will be a part of the larger public debate about maybe, hopefully, about, what happens in Hong Kong has a ripple effect with what happens in the rest of the world. And let's be clear, there are riots taking place not just in Hong Kong, but there are riots in France. We're going to see what happens here fairly quickly with the election in England. So the world is kind of on fire right now. Yeah. And it feels like in some ways Hong Kong is a bit of the tinderbox that could light the rest of the planet up.
That's interesting. And what they're fighting for or against is actually, it's super relevant to what's coming here in the West as well. So, and what's interesting about that too, we were talking a little bit off camera about that, the Mars retrograde in Aries, which is happening later on in the year, but that's going to be squaring off to Pluto. And so, you were talking about boots on the ground. To me, that seems like that's probably when there will be boots on the ground. Mars going back and forth, squaring Pluto in the 10th house, conjunct the Saturn for Hong Kong as well.
Yeah, it's very martial, and Hong Kong will go through a Mars opposition during this time.
Yeah,
and that's conflict. You have a Mars opposition, that's conflict, and Mars, Hong Kong kind of has that built into its chart. It's got Mars in Libra on the cusp of the 7th house, and a lot of this activity that's taken place with what's happening in Hong Kong, started when Mars was around Leo Virgo and was really peaking when Mars was in Libra. Mm-hmm. So we can see that Hong Kong was going through its Mars return and doing its best to flex its social justice muscles. And it's very interesting. I look at kind of where we are in 2019 headed into 2020, and I see the world in conflict, and a lot more quote unquote revolution and strikes, and some of these things will be engineered and manufactured like they are and have been. But I also think that people are getting to a point where we're almost headed towards this kind of nihilistic cliff in some ways, where people are trying to understand, why are we here? What is this all about? Where's the meaning in our existence? A lot of the institutions that people invested in are being demolished, whether it's religion or whether it's family or whether it's children. A lot of these institutions are just, they're being deconstructed. So when that happens, there aren't things for people to have any kind of foundation or mooring with. And when we live in a time where there's no foundation and there's very little mooring, the people are adrift, and there can be a great deal of anxiety, panic, distress, anger, frustration. And we just recently tapped into this full moon, right? This Gemini full moon at 12/12/12/12, the cold moon. And the Sabian symbol for 21 Gemini has to do with a revolutionary magazine. So this is kind of setting the stage in a lot of ways for where we're going to be headed with the nodes, with the true node in Gemini and the south node in Sagittarius. Sagittarius being kind of this idea of the rule of law, right? Like ecumenical law, religious law, orthodox law, universal law, and that's taking a back seat, and what's going to be much more front and center during this time with the nodes in 2020 is this idea of Gemini and kind of making it up as we go, right? That the idea and the expression of some kind of idea on a personal level is greater than this kind of law or this organizing principle that is receding during these nodes. So I think 2020 is going to be a hot time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're coming in with so I'll pull up the eclipse chart. We can kind of move past Hong Kong now. Because we have an eclipse that's happening actually on Christmas. And
yeah.
Actually, I like it. It looks quite nice. I mean, it's an annular solar eclipse, and it's going to be in a conjunction with Jupiter. It's going to be in trine with Uranus. I feel like this could be an opportunity for people to make a lot of positive changes in their life. However, it's followed by this eclipse where we have Saturn and Pluto in an exact conjunction that literally comes exact 2 days after the eclipse. And the eclipse is conjunct that Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And even though it's just a penumbral lunar eclipse, so it's kind of like a weaker eclipse energy in a more general sense, I mean, I feel like that Pluto-Saturn energy makes it super, super strong. It amplifies the transformative potential of it, but also, the potential for crisis.
Yeah, and that leads right into the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 12th, just right in the doorstep of that. Mm-hmm. So the eclipse energy is going to be very interesting in 2020, and especially the July 5th eclipse, which I think is the companion eclipse for the 1226, which really is taking place right on the quote-unquote birthday of the United States.
Yeah, and the last time that happened was actually in 2001.
2001, right, yeah, which 9/11. Is the 9/11, the precursor of 9/11. Yeah, so again, when we get into the story of the eclipses, balancing back and forth between Capricorn and Cancer and Gemini and Sagittarius, we're dealing with some very significant personal forces with Gemini and Cancer, and then the transpersonal forces in sort of descending in a lot of ways with Capricorn and Sagittarius. So there's always this interesting kind of reaction piece that goes along with. So if we decide that we're going to go, and I was talking about this today a little bit, that when Trump came into office, one of the things that he did is he began to deconstruct the politically correct narrative, and so people began to talk about things in a much more brazen, naked, truthful, at times very awkward fashion. But the backlash of that is that now you have entities like Google and YouTube and Facebook creating more of a lockdown on free speech. Mm-hmm. So this is how these things work, right? On the one hand, we have movement in one area, and then we have a reaction coming from the opposite direction. So keep your eyes on, Sagittarian entities, which is this essentially developing, creating, establishing law, and then Capricorn, which is the enforcement of law. So this is another part of the dance of 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with Saturn moving into Aquarius, I mean, Aquarius is technology. It is things like the internet and social media. I think the thought police are going to be cracking down, but then you have the North Node moving into Gemini, which is wanting to have more free expression of speech, right? Wanting to share and communicate ideas more freely. And so I feel like there's almost a discordant energy between the two, because on the one hand, you have the North Node in Gemini, which is wanting to explore these different potentials and different ideas, to think about different things and talk about different things in new ways. And then you have Saturn moving into the sign of Aquarius, which could be stifling that, especially free speech via the internet.
Yeah, and I really feel like that's a great point. And I think it's one of these narratives of our time where we have the potential for real greatness and real explosion and real renaissance on some level. But at the same time, we have this other kind of system that wants to superimpose itself over the top and create greater structures of control in a lot of ways. So this is a very dynamic process in and of itself, and can spawn some very interesting mutations as a result of this. This is kind of how creation works in a lot of ways. So we're going to get to see all that take place right before our very eyes. So I think what will happen is we'll see kind of greater levels of tyranny and control. We'll also see kind of greater expressions of novelty, ingenuity, ways of getting around the system. I mean, humans are pretty creative, and we're pretty complex in our own way. And just when we think, or when they think that they've kind of got us under control, we wind up doing something to kind of hack reality in a very interesting kind of way. So that's going to be another part of the story of 2020 is people, being ingenious and finding new ways to communicate and share and have their ideas be able to transmitted and disseminated in a much, I wouldn't say freer, but creative fashion.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And especially with the North Node in Gemini, to me, it seems like people are going to be looking more toward communicating and connecting more on a local level, right? Because Gemini is your community. It's your neighbors. It's more like grassroots, like what's going on in the here and now right around you. And so one way around that, if there is more limitations and restrictions, that's pretty obvious, is just to actually communicate with the people that you come into contact with every single day and to form connections that way. But also, with Saturn moving into Aquarius, one of the things you told me actually when I was learning from you, like way back when, was I have Saturn and Uranus in a conjunction in my second house, and you told me I had to like create my own structure, right?
Right.
This could be people creating their own structures around the internet, or maybe creating some sort of alternative to the internet, which is something that Russia is like talking about doing, creating like a mirror image of the internet, like their own separate internet, in case the internet gets shut down or something.
Yeah, I think that's true. And as you were talking about that, the two things came to mind. One came to mind before you were talking about that, and another while you were talking. And one of the things that I think we could see a rebirth of in 2020 is the local newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
And because the local newspaper is a really undervalued asset, and the way that printing has come down in price in terms of being able to lay out a paper and everything, you just do it on your computer. Now, printing a paper takes a bit more money, but having a local newspaper, I think, could be really interesting. And it feels like that's kind of a millennial thing, right? Like I can see millennials creating local newspapers. The other thing that I think communities really should wrap their heads around is local internet as a public utility. Yeah. Like, just like we have local water, just like we have local power, a community that has local internet as a public utility,
yes,
it really allows that community to stay online during a time when other internet providers may be going offline. And there's a and you probably know this place, just south of where I am, there's a little town called Comfort. Mm-hmm. And Comfort is a very interesting place. It's an unincorporated city, little town, and so they have to do everything on their own. Well, they actually have their own internet provider in Comfort. So that's kind of a model. And to your point, I think that is something that people theoretically should look into. We could look into so that we can communicate and have ideas, and especially ones that affect us on a day-to-day level.
Absolutely. And actually where I live, we have that. We have the internet is a public utility, and it's like we have our own local internet through the electric co-op, because we don't have like an electric company. It's a co-op.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So you're already involved in that model.
Yeah. So that's awesome. No, I love that. And that is like another way around it, because if it gets shut down more on a mass scale, or if something happens to one of the major internet providers, right? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be that there's like the government shutting down the internet. It could be like some sort of hack or something. That's where right. The internet is shut down, or it's certain providers are completely shut down. So there could, I really feel like there's going to be some sort of internet blackout that's going to be more on a mass scale when sometime in the next 2.5 years with Saturn coming into Aquarius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there certainly is going to be more legislation and more sort of top-down gravitational forces on these Aquarian systems. I totally agree with you, and it's going to be interesting to see again how we respond to this and how we're able to do something different and creative and unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. So with Saturn moving into Aquarius, what else do you think we're going to start seeing? Because we'll start to see a little bit of it, like how we mentioned before. Saturn will move into Aquarius, I believe, in March, and then it'll move out of Aquarius, I think, in June or July, if that's correct, and back into Capricorn. And then by the time we finish out the year, when we move into December, Saturn will be in Aquarius for good for the next couple of years until 2023.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've always found to be instructive is to look at the final degrees of a planet, especially one of the outer planets when it transits from one sign to another. So when Saturn gets to 27, 28 degrees, we'll be able to begin to see the story unfold for Saturn in Aquarius. The incoming sign will leave clues. So, when that happens, people will begin to be able to piece the puzzle together in some way. We won't be able to see the whole puzzle, but we'll see kind of a precursor of where things are going. And Aquarius, of all the signs, tends to be the one sign that is most closely related to socialism. And we're it's becoming kind of more and more of a philosophy du jour in the West on a number of levels. So I could definitely see both the rise of socialism and this backlash towards socialism at the same time, because there are a number of people who have lived through socialistic reigns. Just ask anybody who lives in Miami and is from Cuba. They'll give you a firsthand account of what their experience with socialism was like. So there is that as well. But, that's all kind of headed towards the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that begins in 2025. And when Saturn-Neptune conjunct, in many cases, we see either collective socialistic or communistic paradigms begin to come into existence and form shape. So I think Saturn in Aquarius is going to give us some insight into that, but we're also going to see some of that in those final degrees of Saturn in Capricorn. And you can't talk about Aquarius and you can't talk about the true node in Gemini without addressing things like transgenderism and transhumanism, because when you get into Gemini is this very interesting kind of, unisexual sign in a lot of ways. It's male and it's female. If you look at Hermes, who's representative of Gemini, Hermes is, the father of Hermaphrodite, right? It's Hermes and Aphrodite who have a child together. And Hermaphrodite is hermaphrodite. It's essentially Baphomet, right? The baby Baphomet. So we're going to see some of that with a lot. I think a lot more of that with the true node in Gemini, and also in Aquarius, because that's when we get into all that sort of transhumanistic technology and biology. And then Saturn also represents law, and I think there's going to be a lot of there's going to be significant court cases in 2020 around things like gender participation. 2020, we're going to have the Olympics in Tokyo. And there's been a real push for transgender males to compete in events as women, right? And they're literally cleaning up, and it's not even close in many cases. Yeah. So I would not be surprised to see the 2020 Olympics be a showcase for, at least initially, a court case where a transgender male wants to compete as a woman during the 2020 Olympics. And based upon a lot of the legal rulings that have already taken place, it's been very favorable towards the trans athlete to participate in non-trans events. So that's also going to be a part of where we're headed with Saturn in Aquarius and this true node in Gemini aspect in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, that makes complete sense. And everything you said up until that point too, when you were talking about the socialism aspect of this, So the last time Neptune was in Pisces was when communism was essentially invented, right?
That's right.
And
Yeah.
so we have this like energy already around socialism and communism and these ideals of like a utopian society where everyone is equal, but it's not realistic, right? And that's what we learned the last time around. I feel like this year, because Jupiter's going to be in sextile with Neptune, right? And so this could be a year where there's a lot more of that idealistic energy around socialism or communism. And then, you know, when Saturn comes in and hits Neptune, that's going to be like cold hard reality. Like, oh, now you got what you wanted and look what's happening, right? Like that could be part of this story.
Well, each generation thinks that they could do whatever better, right? Whether it's, well, we could do the internet better than you did the internet. Or, you know, we could do fashion better than you did fashion. Well, we could do communism better than you did communism because, you know, we're, you know, more honest, more transparent, more passionate. And yet, every time this has happened, there's always been this matriculation of power towards the top, and this crystallization and coalescence of power at the top, and then everybody else gets kind of frozen out. And then, I mean, that's just human nature, and that doesn't really depend upon how down or how woke you are. There were a lot of woke people in other regimes, and they were crushed under the thumb of tyranny. So, you know, buyer beware, caveat emptor.
Yeah, until we're like in a non-hierarchical system, it's not, I mean, it's not going to work the way that people think it will. But so anyway, so moving back on to like the Saturn moving into Aquarius, something else that I think is kind of interesting about that is, I mean, Aquarius rules science, right? And we're already seeing, like, I always say that science is the new religion because people are very dogmatically adhering to.
That is so true.
Yeah. And so I feel like that's going to be amplified times like 20 with Saturn in the sign of Aquarius.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny that you mentioned that because there's this whole connection with belief in science, right? And belief is something that religion traffics in.
Yeah.
And it's like you can't even question the science. Well, why? You have to believe it. Well, why? Because the high priests have ordained it so. And there's this really weird transposition, which is exactly what you're talking about. You know, science is the new religion, and it's unquestionable, right? You cannot debate the dogma of science, because if you do, you're a heretic. We saw this here in Fredericksburg when it came to, you know, the fluoride election. We had all these facts on our side.
Yeah.
And they were just as equal and powerful as their facts. But because they were people with initials after their name and they wore white coats, they were part of this priestly caste. And people were and have been conditioned to conform to authority. And they're these kind of medical religio authorities. You're exactly right. And totally with Saturn and Aquarius, it's like the crowning achievement of science as religion.
Absolutely. And even
Darwin was an Aquarian, by the way.
Of course.
That says everything, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. But even if you have the white coat and the letters after your name and you're using actual scientific research to combat like the scientific dogma of the time, the dogma is the dogma and people aren't going to listen to you. So, I mean, even having all of that like flourish, you know, and flair added to it, it doesn't matter to the establishment in science right now. So I'm kind of nervous to see what comes about with that just because of the whole vaccine debate and what's going on with like microchipping and all of these other things that are starting to come about, which I think microchipping will probably be a thing in the next 2.5 years too.
It's here now. It's here now. Apparently they're microchipping the homeless in Austin.
Oh my God.
Yeah. There's this viral video of this guy who's homeless and he's getting a haircut. There's a barbershop in Austin who does haircuts for the homeless, which I think is really, really cool. And this guy was giving this haircut, and he was talking about how he was chipped, and he was told that he would get all these benefits from accepting this chip. And what happened was, was after this video aired, the guy who has this barbershop, because he videotapes all these people that he does these haircuts with. It's not like he was searching for Mr. Chip homeless. You know, he just happened to sit in his chair with one of these haircuts. And he got paid a visit by some guys in suits and ties in dark vehicles. So there's a couple of days ago, there was this big thing happening on William Cannon where there was a lot of homeless. So this is very interesting. They had a bunch of emergency vehicles there. They had a bunch of like stretchers, gurneys or things that people can lay down on, but they were temporary, right? Something was going on with the homeless in this one area. And it wasn't like they were moving them out. It was like they were performing procedures there. So this whole chip thing it's happening, right? And this goes along with some of the ideas around, I think, where socialism is headed, and universal basic income, which is another kind of, appendage of socialism. So to your point, yes, that's going on. And then the other thing you were talking about with vaccines, and this is quite troubling. I was in Nashville about 3 weeks ago, and I was there while Del Bigtree was giving a talk on vaccines, and his presentation was chilling. It was like I was watching something out of, I don't know, it was almost like the Salem witch trials or something like that. Because what they were talking about was, they were talking about this new TAP vaccine. And it was like new in the sense that the adjuvants would get even deeper into a person's immunology. And how vaccines work is they shock your immunology so that you can have a reaction to the vaccine, and then ultimately when that pathogen crosses your path again, now all of a sudden your body knows theoretically what to do. So one of the things, and Del was there, and he said, well, have you tested this with other vaccines? And they said, and by the way, the panel was 3 women, 2 of whom were military outfits, which I thought was really interesting. And they said, well, no, we haven't tested it with other vaccines. And he said, well, what do you plan to do? Well, we'll just administer the vaccine in the other appendage. I'm like, are you kidding?
In that side?
Yes, I mean, are you kidding me?
only your one arm will be protected against, what was it, the DTaP?
Exactly, DTaP, exactly. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, this is where you're talking about science's belief. And by the way, that vaccine passed unanimously. Unanimously.
Oh, of course it did. I mean, yeah, so I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
We are going to see a lot more of that.
Because we are seeing a lot more of that.
And here we go, Saturn in Aquarius. Let's shut down Facebook. Let's shut down the Facebook groups that talk about vaccines. Let's shadow ban people on Twitter. Let's just completely and utterly you destroy and then bury the dialogue.
Yeah,
that's where it's going.
And the what's the Google Chrome browser is actually going to automatically block anti-vaccination content beginning in, I think they said 2020 is when they're going to roll that out. So
that's right. Yeah.
Your computer will automatically decide for you what's fact and what's not. You don't even get the option to look for yourself, because you'll have to go in and, change your settings in order to actually access, like, even scientific articles, really. I mean, and science-based articles. And I mean, that's already what's going on, so it makes perfect sense. But
so a couple of weeks ago, I did a story on these Orthodox women in New York City. Have you seen any of this stuff at all? So all these measles cases happen in large part due to a community of Orthodox Jews in New York City who would not vaccinate their kids, because they don't believe in vaccinations. And so they're going to go through the measles crisis. Their kids are going to get their own immunology and they're going to move on. But what happened was that the city of New York, the state of New York, and a couple of quote unquote scientific rabbis began to chime in and say, oh, you've got to vaccinate your kids. You don't vaccinate your kids, you're going to get a $10,000 fine. You're going to be shunned from the congregation. And there's this great video that I ran across where there are these mothers, these Orthodox mothers, who have done all kinds of research. And they sat there and they challenged this rabbinical doctor, and they challenged him on the research. And he did what people always do. He changed the subject, changed the topic, changed the argument. They had him dead to rights, right? So here, again, is this very interesting kind of petri dish where belief, religion, and science have this really uncomfortable kind of conflict. And these people coming from the belief space were more scientific than the doctor who was a rabbi coming at it from the science or the Western base. And he was just more, it just blows my mind that we're in this incredibly medieval time in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I think they're going to look back on this and people are going to be like, wow, I can't believe that they did that. And the end of argument sort of conversation is always vaccines are safe and effective. The science literally proves that they're not 100% safe and they're not 100% effective, even like the mainstream science that a lot of times is funded by these pharmaceutical companies. So, just that in and of itself should be like, if anyone tells you that this is how you have to think about it and this is the way it is and you can't question it, there's a reason for that. But we could talk about this forever. There's so many things with this going on right now.
I just have one other fact I want to lay on people about this. It's really important because it puts everything in perspective. Mm-hmm. Do you know how long Vioxx was in trials for?
No.
3 years. They did 3 years of Vioxx trials, meaning some people got a little sugar tablet and some people actually got Vioxx. 3 years. Vioxx was a very controversial drug. It was a pain reliever. And even though they had their 3-year trials, a lot of people suffered neurological damage due to Vioxx, and there was a big lawsuit against the makers of Vioxx. But at least they had a 3-year trial. Do you know how long trials for vaccines last?
Usually just a couple months.
Try a week, 2 weeks at the most.
Sometimes less than that, yeah.
Right. That's all you need to know about the vaccine industry. Mm-hmm. That's
it. So moving on to different topics. Now that we've gotten all heated. But no, it's really important and it is coming up. And, the people that are going to.
Well, it is. This gets back into Saturn and Aquarius.
Yeah.
And the kind of the onset of Pluto and Aquarius and what we would call the New Age.
Yeah.
What kind of New Age or what kind of world or what kind of community do you want to be able to participate and live in? Mm-hmm. Do you want to live in a dark New Age where the high priests and the lords of science are doling out your medicine and your belief system, and as long as you go along to get along and you get your chip and you'll get your $1,500 a month and you get to ride around on an electric scooter, is that the world you want to live in? Or do you want to live in a world where you actually are taking responsibility for your life, your beliefs, your ideas, what you put in your body? You become your own high priest, you become your own high priestess, you become your own scientist, right? This is the divergence of the world we're headed. And Saturn in Capricorn Aquarius will be able to start to determine what that world is going to look like. And it's not a done deal. It's not like we're going to be in lockdown with a dark New Age, although that is really a possibility. Mm-hmm. It's very much a possibility. A lot of it depends on how people can wake up, how quickly they can wake up, how quickly you can shake your belief systems, get unhooked, and begin to see the world really as it is and not how you want it to be. And once you have that perspective, then you could create something out of it.
Absolutely. And that's where we segue kind of into the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, which you can see really strongly in this eclipse chart on July 4th, because that's really going to be expanding on the truth, expanding on the cold hard reality of what's going on here and helping people to get that sense of perspective. This is what's really happening and this is what I need to do about it. And so I think that that's actually going to be kind of helpful as a precursor to all of this energy moving into the sign of Aquarius.
I think so too. And again, we'll tap into the millennials. because the millennials have Uranus and Neptune in the sign of Capricorn in their chart. So a lot of this phase, period, and cycle that we're in will be very millennial centric. And because Jupiter is going to be crossing, your Neptune and your Uranus, which theoretically and hopefully gets millennials to start to think about how they want to take responsibility and take some level of kind of personal authority, because your generation is, the reins of the planet are going to be handed to your generation, right? At some point, the boomers going to die out, Gen X is going to die out. It's going to be you guys and then the crazy Gen Z kids, which you're going to have to deal with. So, this is the time, really, with Jupiter, commingling with Saturn, on your natal Uranuses and on your natal Saturns, because a lot of you went through your Saturn returns. This is the time to grow up. Mm-hmm. This is your time to grow up and to take accountability, responsibility for the world that you want to create. And Capricorn is not low level; it is very high level. Mm-hmm. So start your own businesses, start your own communities, start your own economies, right? Because that's really going to be the thing that will determine sort of exactly what you were talking about, where things are going in Aquarius.
Yeah, absolutely. And that Pluto, Jupiter in the sign of Capricorn, responsibility. I mean, Saturn in Capricorn, yeah, a lot of that was about self-responsibility, but you also saw like the state and the government and everything sort of bearing down on people. I think Pluto is, like, in terms of planetary energy, it's way more intense, it's way more independent, it's way more about what you truly believe and what you truly desire, your own, variation of the truth and what's right for you. And I think that really will help people to transform their experience and their perspective on the world, especially with that Jupiter energy. So I think it'll be helpful for sure. But it could also expand on things that are not so pleasant to look at too. Just kind of like when Jupiter went into the sign of Scorpio, right? We saw, pedophilia and the Me Too movement and all these things starting to really be expanded on and brought out into the open. I think that this could be a similar energy, but having to do more with the government structures.
Oh, I think we're going to see egregious overreach of governments. That's a given.
Yeah.
That's a given. It's like, whoa, come on now. Whoa, wait a minute, And it's like, really? But that'll be a good thing too, because that'll wake people up. That'll get people's attention and be like, oh, geez, really? Now we're going to have to deal with this. Also, corporations, who I think have superseded the power of governments, are also under this microscope. Mm-hmm. And we're going to see the overreach of corporations too, and their corporate decision making. And we're already seeing that with big tech, and we're going to see more of that. Corporations are going to be making unilateral decisions that people are not going to like. Some people may like them, but I'd say by and large, you're going to see more and more people like, why are they doing this, right? I mean, we're going to see what's behind the facade of a lot of these corporations, who's pulling the strings, why. It's going to be all out there, folks. You're going to get to see it all. You're going to get to see all of it with Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, all in Capricorn, some of the South Node action up through the end of April, beginning of May. It's going to be all on display. And if you're not enlightened and you can't see the game by the end of 2020, you just may as well take the next century off. Okay, this is going to be all out there.
And I think that's personally a really positive thing, because if there's this level of transparency and you can see it all out on the table, you need that in order to understand what to do with that, right? Or how to counteract that, or how to create something alternative to that, because you have to really understand what you're dealing with fully and completely. And I don't think most people have that understanding right now. And I don't even think we have that understanding right now. I think there are things that are going to be revealed that we don't even know about yet. So
I would agree with that. I would totally agree with that. But we can see this in action right now, currently, with what's happening in Washington with this so-called impeachment. Again, remember, we're dealing with South Node in Capricorn, and we're seeing the government create this kind of bizarre, surreal theater.
Yeah, it's all theater.
If you're really paying attention,
on all sides, it's theater.
You're just going, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And that in and of itself should be enough to wake you up.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of people are, you can tell nobody's super interested. I mean, some people are, but a lot of people are just disinterested with this whole impeachment thing, not wanting to hear about it anymore. I mean, the fact that this is all like divide and conquer is completely obvious on all levels. And more people are starting to understand that, especially millennials. Even millennials who were more conventional and not really open to these things, I'm seeing them start to realize that, hey, this doesn't add up. This doesn't make sense. This is a distraction. They're trying to divide us. They want us to argue about these things. So let's not do that anymore.
That's good, because I think that's the net effect of what we're seeing, and that hopefully people will no longer buy into this idea of us and them.
Yeah.
Because that's, I mean, to me, that's like this, social accelerant. An accelerant is, what people who commit arson use. They'll put an accelerant on something, and then they'll, light a match, and the thing will go up in flames even faster. And so this divide and conquer has been this social accelerant, towards potentially a civil war. And I think a civil war would be terrible for this country, and it would be terrible for the world.
And that makes sense. And so like this year, though, we have Neptune in that sextile with Jupiter. And so something I was mentioning, I was recording like my own separate 2020 video just before this, was that I think that this is going to help people to understand that we're all interconnected. We're all like one, right? And so this divisiveness isn't going to like hold anymore if we have this really nice interconnected energy where people are much more compassionate. They understand that everything is connected. They understand that we're all one human race, and that, we need to look out for each other. That's what I think is going to happen with this really nice Jupiter-Neptune energy. Yes, it's idealistic, but it's, a positive, supportive aspect between these two planets.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I'd like to think that as a species, we deserve that.
Yeah.
I'd like to think so. I also, at times, am a bit jaundiced in my beliefs that it can actually take place, because I've seen so much propaganda being manufactured around certain groups that I don't necessarily think that people are actually thinking with their right minds. They're thinking with their programmable minds. So in order for this to really occur, people are going to have to break their programming and break their spell. And in order to do that, you have to leave the comfort of your group.
That's true too. And well, the thing about that is, though, it's just propaganda, right? It's all fake. None of it's real. What's real is this. What's real is that we are all interconnected. We're all in this together. And so I think that that's going to help people see that, because it literally is all propaganda. If people are in this divisive mindset, it's because they've been told to be that way. They've been told that that person is the other, and I need to fight that person because they're the cause of all the problems, because we're intentionally being distracted from the actual cause of all the problems, which are these Capricornian, Saturnian, Plutonian energies with these corporations and the government and the corporatocracy that's all sort of mingled up together and trying to control everything. So it's kind of like, look over here, look over here. That person's bad because they like Trump. That person's bad because they like Hillary. When really what's going on has nothing to do with any of this ever. If there's like a giant mess going on social media, or something that they're yelling about on the mainstream media, it's because there's something more important going on that they don't want you to look at.
History, known or otherwise, has always operated in these cycles. Mm-hmm. And there's a beginning of a cycle, and then there is the end of a cycle. And sometimes the ends of those cycles seem to be somewhat organic, and sometimes the end of a cycle tends to be manufactured. Mm-hmm. And when we come to an end of a cycle, that's usually connected to with things like revolution and war and conflict and overthrow. And then when that happens, that cycle or that age or that era is eradicated. And then the telling of the tale historically becomes something very new, very different, and represents this kind of new story or this new narrative. But behind all these cycles, the same forces are always manipulating the change. They're always manipulating the change. And they're always getting certain groups and individuals to do their bidding so that they're theoretically part of the new story, or they're the new chosen group, when in actuality they're there for a period of time, until they decide to change the story, change the cycle, or reset history again. And we're in that moment in time now. We're in kind of a historical reset, and that's a whole nother show we could talk about. But so we're in a very interesting time. We're really on the cusp, using an astrological term, of one age and another age. And our intention, our awareness, and our consciousness will, to some extent, determine where that goes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so kind of moving on from that, like whole idea of like moving from one cycle to the next, which is interesting that you're talking about like switching the chosen people and all of that. I have a friend that talks about this as like the emperor changing clothes. So it's just like the changing of the guard. It's the same thing, but with a different package.
That's right.
And I think that's what we're being fed right now. Absolutely. And you're definitely correct about that. But like moving back to, I guess, the astrology part of this, because
well, I mean, it is astrological too, because we're talking about, going from Capricorn, and Pluto and Capricorn. I mean, really, if you examine Pluto and Capricorn, it is the death of culture. Yeah. That's what it is, right? It is the death of the 10th house and the death of time. And as we move into Pluto and Aquarius, like that is the birth of something new, right? So what we're really engaged here is a deeply astrological conversation. Yes. About the end of like the 20th century and Western culture and all that stuff. But where are you going to go? Because you wanted to bring it back to another astrological piece.
Along with this, because I wanted to talk a little bit more about Jupiter with Pluto. Because last time we had Jupiter with Pluto, and this is kind of like Pluto starting to enter the end degrees, right? So we're seeing like the tail end of this huge saga of Pluto and Capricorn. It's being highlighted by the conjunction with Jupiter to Pluto. And the last time we had this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction was actually at the very end of 2007, I think is when that started. And so then we had the huge financial collapse, or the Great Recession in 2008, when the housing bubble collapsed. And so this is happening, but just in a different variation of this again. And so I'm hearing a lot of murmurings about like a stock market bubble or something like that, and the stock markets are going to collapse, or this other area is going to collapse. It's going to come about in a different way. But, murmurings of like financial difficulties beginning in 2020. So I wanted to see maybe what you thought about that, because it seems like we're in the middle of like a financial reset, and we're kind of overdue for something like that.
Yeah. So I was talking with somebody today on my YouTube channel about this idea of the financial reset. And there are people who think that it's long overdue, and there are certain people that think that it would be a good thing to have a financial reset. Okay, well, I'm down with that. But there's not going to be any financial reset that doesn't include the strengthening of the position of the central bankers.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ruling class, the elite families, the black nobility, the Rothschilds, the Goldschmidts, you know who they are, right? And some of them you don't know who they are, but they're there. And they've been profiting off of human capital for centuries, okay? So any kind of financial reset is going to improve their position. And if you just look at Saturn, Pluto, Jupiter, all in Capricorn, right, where are those resources going? All those resources are going somewhere.
Yeah.
They're going to people ultimately who want to control most of the resources. So the reset that I think people are talking about would be the end of capitalism as we know it, right? And there would be some new kind of financial system that would evolve out of that. But when capitalism ends, and some people say, oh, great, let's just end capitalism. And there's a lot of bad things about capitalism, especially unchecked capitalism. But when that ends, like there are going to be people who are deeply vested in the capitalistic game that are just going to take all the rest of the chips on the table. I mean, that's what they'll do. This is Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn. They get the resources. And then we get the reset, and it's like, okay, well, here's your universal basic income. Now, on a personal level, I really feel like people need to understand this. And however you can, and I'm not saying that 2020 is like a death position, but 2020 is the beginning of a new decade and a new time. And we're dealing with, 220s, which represent the judgment card in the major arcana, which is the end of one era, the beginning of another. So there is a sense of get your shit together. right? Strengthen your position. Whatever your position is. Is it your body? Can you get healthy? That's strengthening your position. Can you have a little victory garden? That's strengthening your position. So take this time in this year ahead to strengthen your position, just as these quote unquote oligarchs or bankers are strengthening their position. It's still the same game. How are you going to survive? How are you going to take more command and authority over your own personal enterprises? I think that's the question we all have to stare down, no matter what our resources are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're right. The last time around, the rich got richer and the people who, like the average person, did not benefit from, what happened financially. And that was also kind of an end cycle, right? That was at the very end of Sagittarius when that
At
happened.
the end of Pluto and Sagittarius. And so again, we can see the precursor of what's coming. Yeah. It always happens. Those last 2 degrees of a sign will give us insight as to what's ahead. There's this guy that owns the Carolina Panthers now. His name is David Tepper. And David Tepper became one of the most successful hedge fund billionaires in this country. He's probably the richest owner now in the National Football League. And David Tepper got rich because after the housing crisis, instead of taking money out of banks, David Tepper invested in banks because David Tepper knew that those banks were going to be bailed out. And so he basically became super rich because the American taxpayers, me and you, decided to rescue these insolvent banks, right? And this gives you an idea, gives everybody else an idea as to how the rich profit. The rich will profit off of disaster, distress, and other people's misfortunes. And they're very, very good at it. So if indeed we're headed into a period where we do have an economic crisis, you can see that they've already shown their cards, and history tells their story, and they'll just get even richer as a result of this.
I agree. And, I'm kind of wondering, just kind of looking at this chart for the eclipse and just thinking about Uranus and Taurus and what's been going on so far, if this collapse is going to have to do with like the farming industry, like big agriculture, because what we've been seeing this year in particular is like record numbers of especially large scale monocropped industrial farms in the United States filing for bankruptcy. And while that's not a good thing for those farmers and for the overall economy, and for maybe our food supply, at least to a certain extent, I mean, it's something that I already predicted was going to be happening and that I think needs to happen. And so I'm wondering if there's going to be a large scale collapse with the farming industry, because it's not sustainable. The climate's changing too, and like people are having natural disasters, flooding out crops. People's corn crops are failing. People are not buying industrial farmed tortured pus milk anymore, so that industry is failing. And so now that people are starting to wake up, and the people that have the financial ability to make better choices, because not everybody has that obviously, but the ones who do pretty much are. And you vote with your dollars. And so this industry, I think, is starting to go under.
Yeah, I mean, we had a huge amount of flooding in the Midwest early in the growing season, which was a disaster for big agri, and even with a lot of the cattle, really suffered with that. And we also had the onset of a very early frost as well. So American farming has been critically impaired over this past year. In China, they've had a terrible plague with their pigs, and their pigs dying. And so American farmers have been supplying China with a lot of American pork. And so we can understand this as being a global dilemma in a lot of ways as well. Really interesting story about the Russians. When the United States began to place tariffs on the Russians, and this was, I'd say probably right around 2015, right around there, 2015. The Russians, Vladimir Putin, decided to get rid of any existing American products inside of Russia, and this included food products as well, right? So if you had a restaurant in Russia and you were using American food products, whether they were spices or canned goods or whatever, those were no longer available to you. Like they literally were forcing Russian restaurateurs to get rid of those products, and they were like smashing them and burning them and all kinds of stuff. So what the Russian economy, the Russian farmers, the Russian restaurateurs, the Russian cooks had to do is they had to go through a period of austerity, and they had to look around and say, well, what do we have that's available to us? And so they began to mine and farm, their own resources, their own food, their own vegetables. And out of this came a very kind of unique Russian Renaissance with their cuisine and their chefs. And what we have not been able to wrap our heads around in some ways in the West is this idea that sometimes austerity can be a wonderful teacher and can give us some tools in which we can be creative within the bounds of limitation. And in that case, the austerity was enforced from the outside. And sometimes that will happen. And I have a feeling that that's going to happen here as well, based on some of the things that you were saying. So yes, it will force us to be more local, or to kind of eschew this, mass marketing. But I at times I still have, I look at commercials a lot, and there's been this huge movement to embrace the Beyond Beef burger. Like, what is that about?
A horrible Uranus and Taurus.
What is that shit about, right? I mean, Burger King is just like tripling down on Beyond Beef because it's a virtue signal. It's a corporate virtue signal because it shows that they're down with the plant-based diet and the plant-based economy. And it's really funny. It's really funny. It's really funny watching Burger King try to sell this burger because their commercials are all about very macho people, eating this fake burger and looking into the camera and telling them how much they like the burger, how much it tastes like beef. So there's the downside to all of this too, right?
There is, and they're trying to grow meat separate from an animal, out of cells and things. They're doing all sorts of weird, just gross stuff on that, and none of it's going to last. I mean, it's not sustainable. It doesn't make any sense. It's not healthy for you. But yeah, it is a thing right now, and it's just, I think it's disgusting.
It's totally disgusting. And God, I just, I look at these commercials sometimes and I'm just blown away. But you have to understand that, commercials are about predictive programming.
Yeah.
And they're trying to create and graft a new reality that doesn't exist yet so that you can move into it. And when you move into it, it creates a kind of a memory that it's already occurred, right? Because you saw the commercial for it.
Yeah.
And some of it is really disturbing. Like one of the other commercials that I find, and this is, by the way, gets into the nodes too. Because there's a lot of commercials right now that are deeply entrenched in that true node in Cancer.
Yeah.
If you pay attention, I want to do a piece on this because there's this new style of commercials where the lighting is really low. It's not, it's like you're in somebody's living room and there's a family situation and a family setting. It's very intimate and very informal, right? So these people that create these commercials are really attuned to astrology, as far as I'm concerned. But there's this one commercial that, it's a series of commercials, and it's Kraft macaroni and cheese. I'm sorry, I just have to talk about this. And so it starts off with a mother who's created a really nice meal. And the meal is like a nice salmon with beautiful lemon on it. And she brings it out, and there's this shit kid in her family who pretends like he's choking and vomiting. And so instead of sitting the shit kid down and having him eat this beautiful salmon that mom has prepared, what does mom do? Oh, mom breaks out the Kraft macaroni and fucking cheese. And it's like, okay, you've extorted me. Now we get to have this really interesting product, this tasty product of processed foods. So instead of this wonderful meal that I've created, this is going on in commercials right now, right? But again, what are we talking about? They're eschewing a protein, which is a fish, in order to have a starch and, some questionable dairy product, right? I'm sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent and rant here, but it gets into this idea of kind of where things are headed, and this kind of the bad side of the Uranus Taurus sort of equation of things.
Why do you think astrologically there's been such a huge push for veganism in the past couple of years? Because that's really exploded. But on the opposite token, I've also seen a lot of vegans who have been vegans for many, many years become very ill and start eating, just do a 180 a lot of times and just eat only meat, like straight carnivore. So there's a lot of talk of like meat-based versus plant-based diets. And that's been like a big... I mean, do you think that's Uranus and Taurus? Because Taurus has an association with food. It's strange the way that that's just all of a sudden everyone's vegan and everybody's talking about being vegan. And back when I did it, it wasn't cool and everybody thought I was crazy. And now that I eat meat, everyone's vegan.
Neptune, I think when Neptune went into Pisces, I think everything got kind of cast into this great miasmic spell. Okay. And everything was kind of up for grabs, right? Because Neptune and Pisces represent such a wide spectrum of possibility, you know, from the divine to the hellish. And somewhere in there, based on some kind of good feeling, like don't harm any animals, you know, don't harm anything. You know, I think you're into that Neptune and Pisces kind of world where everything is, you know, kind of pristine and untouched and beautiful and sacred and so on and so on. And somewhere in there, you know, people lost the plot. And if you follow some of these vegan YouTubers who start off, you know, with that kind of initial radiance of what it's like to detox and cleanse your body and eat some, you know, some real whole food for a while, they look great. And then after that, it just goes downhill. Because your body needs protein, your body needs to build, and they wind up becoming sort of ensconced in this very Neptunian, Piscean, delusional state. Like they're walking around like stick figure zombies, and everybody else can see that they're really unhealthy, but they can't see it, right? I mean, that's so Neptune Pisces, because they're so objective or subjective in their world. But to your point, some of these YouTubers were busted eating meat. Yeah.
They had to. And I mean, I went through the same thing. I was vegetarian for 10 years. And I mean, you know, when we met, I was so sick. Like that was like the height of my chronic illness was when we first met. And one of the biggest things that turned things around for me was eating meat. And it's not just the protein. There are a lot of micronutrients in meat, and especially in organ meats, that you can't get in the same bioavailable way. And for some people, it might work. I'm not saying that everyone has to eat meat. I'm sure there are some people that would do better with a vegan diet than others, but for most people, it doesn't seem to be sustainable in the long term. And people seem to be delusional. They're like, oh, but we don't have to eat meat to survive. But that doesn't mean that it's healthy. You know, it doesn't mean that it's good. And also, our bodies are not meant to be herbivores. Herbivores have really long digestive systems with like multiple chambers and stomachs and all sorts of things to digest all of these really dense, like fibrous foods that we don't have that. So, I mean, just looking at our biology, I mean, we're omnivores. So it's just, anyway, it's just strange. It is. It's like a delusional thing. Like
it's totally delusional. Neptune and Pisces has been one of the most delusional periods that I can remember.
Yeah.
And I think the vegan religion or the cult of veganism is part of that as well. So you bring up a really good point that cows have multiple stomachs. They can handle this stuff.
All herbivores, even monkeys that are herbivores have like, that's why their like midsection is huge.
Yeah.
Like, they have like so many intestines in there. We don't have that.
We don't have that. And on the alternative health tip, there's been a lot of studies done recently on oxalates. And
oxalate poisoning. My friend just had that. She was vegan for like 17 years.
That's right. And a lot of the foods that she's eating create these crystals inside of your body that your body cannot break down. And they accumulate inside of your organs like your liver and your kidney and your gallbladder. And they make it very hard for those organs to function because they're working triple time in order to get these funky little crystals, these oxalate crystals, out of the body. right? So we have our awareness now that's coming through about oxalates. We also have awareness that's been coming through for the past few years about lectins and how lectins create inflammation. Okay, so you look at the foods that create lectins and you look at the foods that create oxalates. There's a lot of vegetables in there, right? So you're removing probably about 80% of the vegetable family. And now what are we looking at? We're really looking at like meat and very, very simple kinds of vegetables that do not cause the system to work triple time in order to process and manage food. And that's where I've gone with my diet. I just keep my diet super, super simple. And I realized that, you know, I love a good salad, but salads were wrecking me, man. They were totally wrecking me.
Salads actually, when they were first invented, they weren't like a giant pile of leaves that you're eating. It was like you would have a steak or something, and then like the royalty of the time would have like a garnish of lettuce, and that would be like their salad, and then it just grew from there. So like we didn't just start out just eating salads. And anyway, this is a whole different topic that we're getting into, like the astrology of food, I guess.
Yeah.
But you're right. It doesn't. It's not natural to just be consuming piles of leaves. Like that's not something that we would probably do thousands of years ago. And I know that we didn't do thousands of years ago. But
let's bring it back to astrology though, because I think this is an interesting topic, right?
It really is. We should do a video just on like the astrology of what people eat or something.
Well, but it's also food as a system of control, right?
That's true.
Because let's say I'm eating meat, you're eating meat, we're healthy, we're vibrant, we're able to have protein, accessible protein. We're in a lot of ways less manageable, right?
We're healthy. They want us to be sick, obviously. That's why most people are sick.
But there's also like a mindset and a transference that goes along with consuming protein. You know, when you have protein, there is the hunter and the hunted. Protein is the basis and the foundation for all intents and purposes a predatory diet. And when I say that, I don't say predatory in the sense that, predatory in terms of young people or people who are vulnerable or sick or weak. I'm talking about hunter-gatherers, right? So if you're eating meat, you are less susceptible to being a herd animal. It's the way it is. You're less susceptible.
Oh, weird. Yeah. I see the symbolism. That's interesting.
Right. So they want to move people into a plant-based diet because there is a psychology and a biology and a physiology that is connected to a plant-based diet that is much more herd-like and much more governable. Okay.
Wow. Now,
the other thing that's really interesting that I've kind of put together in my twisted conspiratorial mind is that there are there's this thing that happened in London recently on this bridge where this guy had a knife and he started stabbing people, right? You know the story, don't you?
No.
Oh, about 2 weeks ago, it was a big deal. There was like a big terror event on a bridge in London where this guy who was apparently a Muslim had a knife. He was stabbing people. So, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, the bridge is an interesting symbol because it represents this causeway from one point to another, right? From one destination to another destination. Bridges represent transitions. And so you have this guy with this knife, and it's like, oh my God, knives are terrible. Knives are bad. You know, they already don't have any guns in London. So maybe we should start getting rid of the knives. Well, you can't get rid of knives because knives are really good at what? Cutting meat. Right?
I was going to say that. Like they're trying to, it's a conspiracy against cutting your steak.
It's all part of this kind of compendium. Well, you know, if we go to a plant-based diet, why do we need sharp knives? All we need are, recyclable hemp serrated edges, and then it's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So let's just take away another level, theoretically of defense and threat, right? So there's this kind of paradigm that goes along with the plant-based diet that is kind of vast in its potential for control.
Yeah, because then, I mean, if everybody's eating a plant-based diet, they don't have to give out hunting licenses. You don't have to have a gun to hunt food. So even hunters don't need guns anymore because
That's right.
you're not hunting anything unless you're like living on a ranch somewhere and, you know, you're protecting your livestock. Maybe that would, but that you don't need livestock because we're not eating it. So
that's right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it really does take all that. Wow, that's weird. Yeah, it makes sense.
Right, and it also sounds so nice and Aquarian, you know, to have a plant-based diet. And I'm seeing commercials for freaking plant-based butter. Oh, here's a.
That's always been a thing, though. Margarine.
I know. Here's a very important and decorated chef, and she's baking with plant-based butter, and oh boy, she really likes it. You know, come on, give me a break. You know, butter's actually really good for you. You know, it's one of those essential fats for your brain, and your brain really needs it. Well, but they don't care.
That's where we got to kind of get into the changes in the way that we farm, right? Because that Uranus in the sign of Taurus, because we can't continue with like mass scale industrial farming of meats where we're torturing these animals. They're not full of nutrition. They're full of antibiotics and fake hormones and diseases. And, you know, we're eating that, right? And so this is where if we are going to continue eating meat, I do actually agree with the fact that we can't have factory farm meats on an ethical level, but also just for sustainability too. Like it just doesn't, it's not sustainable to do things in that way anymore. And so with like dairy and meats and things like that, I think that that's going to be part of it too.
I agree with you. And I think there's plenty of room for ethical farming, the ethical raising of animals. I think there's plenty of room for that. I think that farming and the raising of animals for slaughter, I mean, they will be slaughtered and they will be turned into food. I think that this is a tradition that goes back a very long time, and there's a lot of honor in it. And again, if you are a millennial, here's an opportunity for you to do something. If you feel very strongly about this, create something different, create something new. And I know some millennials that are doing this. You know, they've got their own farms, they've got they're returning to the land, and they're trying to figure this stuff out. And we need a lot of this to take place in order for us to be able to sustain our population and sustain our society and displace a lot of the factory farming. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, and that is a big, I mean, if you are worried about carbon, if you're one of those people, like switching to a more sustainable, like renewable form of agriculture actually like takes away carbon, even if you're using animals and stuff like that. But that's a whole big thing. You could talk to Matt about that for like hours if you really wanted to, because that's something he wants to do later on. But let's move on to the next topic, or like the final sort of wrap up of this conversation, because we're kind of getting lengthy here. It is for the whole year though. But so at the end of this year, we're coming into, and I almost don't even want to bring this up just because of like what's going to happen in my comment section, but we're having an election. It's going to happen. Theoretically, it's going to happen. I know you've mentioned the idea of maybe it not happening in some of your videos in the past, but we're having an election in the United States. There's going to be a Mars retrograde. We talked a little bit about the Mars retrograde coming into that square with Pluto. And then shortly after that, we're having the Great Conjunction, which is the conjunction between the Great Malefic and the Great Benefic planets, which would be Saturn and Jupiter. And so historically, what we've seen under the Great Conjunction is that presidents that are elected under this conjunction, there's usually either an assassination attempt or they're actually assassinated. The last two times there was an attempt but no actual assassination. But prior to that, every president that was elected who was in office under this conjunction has been assassinated. That's not to say that that's what's going to happen this time around, but it seems like if history is going to repeat itself and these cycles are repeating itself, something's going to happen. And this election season seems pretty intense. So I feel like we would be doing a disservice not to talk about it, even though I'm always hesitant to get into politics.
Oh yeah, I have nothing to say about that. You know, it's no. Nothing. So I was on Clyde Lewis's show last night, and we were talking about this, and particularly in relationship to this moon that we just went through on 12/12/12/12, which is symbolic of the Hanged Man. and because 12 is the number of the hanged man, and it's also a number of completion in a lot of ways, right? 12 houses in astrology, and we have 12 and 12, the 2 cycles, 2 12-hour cycles of the day. So there's something very intrinsic about this number, and with the hanged man, nobody really wins, right? I mean, let's say, for instance, because I don't think Trump is going to be impeached. There's too much going on right now, and he is sort of alchemically transmutating, and all the anger and the hate and the vitriol, he just leans right into it. And he's just like this dark star that just consumes it. I've never seen anything like it. So I don't think he's going to, I mean, he could be impeached legally, but he's not going to be removed from office. Mm-hmm. But there are people that I know this for a fact, who are congresswomen and congressmen who are being cajoled, coerced, in some instances perhaps even forced to vote on impeachment, and they don't want to. They don't want to because they don't believe that the Democrats have an impeachable case. And if that's true, then their political careers can be over, right? They will be toast. So they're kind of hanging out in this hangman position. Like, their loyalty is demanding that they vote a certain way, but the reality is saying, if you vote that way and it doesn't go that way, you're over, right? And in a lot of ways, that's kind of symbolic of where we are in America. And there's going to be no real winner to the election. I mean, Trump could win, and I believe if we do have an election, he's going to win. The true node is going to be in Gemini on the election. That's in his 10th house. He is a Gemini. Sun-Uranus conjunction. If we go the distance, we do have an election, you can book it. You're dealing with another 4 years of Trump, whether you like it or not, right? Now, that said, what's going to be the blowback around that? Okay. Like, I think it could be really bad.
Yeah.
Really, really bad. And let's say I'm not right. And there are times I'm not right. We all have moments where we miss the mark, we overshoot something, or something we don't see. Let's say Hillary comes in, or Michelle Obama comes in, and somehow they win. Or, Michael Bloomberg, I don't think stands a chance. Maybe he wins. What do you think the people on the right are going to do? Do you think after 4 years of MAGA rallies, you think they're just going to lay down? Yeah. And you say, tip the cap to the winner? Okay, you're president now. We're just going to, play nice. You think that's going to happen? That's not going to happen. So everything has been stoked, right? Everything has been sort of fomented and created to have this potentially really explosive effect. And I've looked at that chart for election night, and it is not a good chart. It is not a good chart. So to me, it's like a threshold that we have to pass through. And it's almost like a bloody baptism in some ways, that if there's going to be kind of a new America or a new time, that we're going to have to pass through this moment, and it may not be pretty.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And especially with just the past 4 years, like the hugely divisive and aggressive and sort of violent rhetoric that's been pushed on us on both sides. I mean, I could totally see that happening. I hope that doesn't happen. But in a lot of ways, it kind of like something like that might need to happen, right? In order for us to move into something different.
We've been. It
does need to happen in order for us to move into something different, because we can't continue on with exactly the same thing over and over again. We've been electing new presidents every 4 years, hoping that somehow that's going to change something. And nothing's changed and nothing's gotten better. It's gotten worse and worse and worse. No one's going to argue that the United States is like, the government is exactly how we want it and everybody's happy and we all have, this abundance or anything like that. So I don't know.
Well, Trump is very different in the sense that he represents the status quo, but he also is a massive disruptor of the status quo. So he's a very different kind of president in a lot of ways, because he is a disruptor, whether you believe in his disruption or not.
Well, it's obviously disruptive, the fact that he exists as the president of the United States, even.
Well, right. And like I said, I mean, he's disrupted this cycle. I mean, we've all known that the media lies and it has been corrupt for a very long period of time. But now you have somebody that talks about it all the time and has been.
Where has that gotten us? It's gotten more. It's gotten us more censorship.
It has gotten us more censorship. I would totally agree with you, but it's almost like we have to go through this, though, right? We have, and to your point, I think we have. There's a whole series of movies about the purge, and so that's one version of kind of where people think that this should go. Right, that we should, kill all the boomers, kill Whitey, kill the middle class, kill the status quo, and with the blood of the revolution on our hands, we can start something new, right? So that's one version of this. But there's another version where it is not just that, but it is a more kind of inclusive version of this idea of purging the toxicity of the system itself. And not just a group that has been associated with the system for the last, theoretically, 200 years, right? Because that in and of itself is not the complete story or the complete picture. It's a selective narrative. So, but I do agree that there is a toxicity inside the system that does need to be purged and gotten out. And how we do that, well, that remains to be seen.
All right. Well, that's that's what's going on there. So let's end on maybe a happier note. So what do you think we can...
I thought that was a happy note. What are you talking about? No.
That was an ominous, ambiguous note, I think.
Isn't vomiting really happy? I mean, come on now. Everybody loves to vomit. So what's the happy note? Let's be happy.
Okay, so what do you think the potential is this year? In its biggest, most sort of just idealistic state, what can we take out of this year and what can we do with this energy to promote a better future amidst this? This is a time of transformation. It's a time of turbulence. It's a time where things are changing. And we do have some say in the way that it changes. So what do you suggest that we can do with this?
Well, I look at the judgment card, the 220s, that's part of the 2020 code. And so as we move into this kind of aeonic period of, culture shift, it also reflects upon us individually and internally. So, there's a story there about parts of our worlds that are ending and new parts of our worlds that can begin and can open up. And this can be a very exciting time if you're willing to face endings in your life courageously and say, well, these chapters are closed now. And I'm willing to step out into sort of the new dawn or the new era of my own experience. Because I think that that's available for everybody. And it's not just sort of the global story, it's our story as well. And that takes a little bit of courage. If you're younger, I think it's a little easier. If you're older and you're more inclined towards ideas and notions around security, I think it could be a bit more difficult. But I think that's what's up, right? And the other thing, too, is that, 2020 is the year of the rat in Chinese astrology.
Oh, yeah.
And the rat is very resourceful and very entrepreneurial and very clever. So this is a year where being resourceful and being clever and being entrepreneurial can really work to the best of one's advantage, no matter what your birth sign or Chinese astrological sign is. So you add that together with the potential for a new epoch and a new era in each of our lives, and it can be very exciting. It can be very, very exciting if you're willing to make some moves, take some risks, and kind of experience a rebirth, because I do think that that's available this year.
Absolutely. See, there's the high note.
I'm not always doom and gloom. Come on, I've got another side going on here. You bring it out in me, Heather, I have to say. Not the doom and gloom part, the optimistic part.
Well, you bring out a lot of tangents in me, apparently, because we went really long. on this video, but I love doing these discussions. It's been way too long, so we definitely need to come back together and figure out some maybe creative topics to talk about in 2020, so that way.
Yeah, sure.
Everyone's been asking, when are you bringing Robert back on? Well,
and then I'll be on there like, oh, it's that guy again.
I know, right?
All he fucking talks about is politics and Trump. That's not astrology.
Well, anyway, there are a lot of people that love these discussions, and I'm sure they'll be happy to see this posted. And if you want to connect with Robert, I know you're doing some holiday specials for readings and for your course and all of that. And so everybody can find you at robertphoenix.com, and I'll also post a link to Robert's YouTube channel. He does a lot of really interesting videos about the astrology and, you know, socio-political stuff. And so if that's something that interests you, you can find him there. And do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, it's just I really have enjoyed like hanging out with you because we haven't done this in a while, and let's try to do it a few more times in the coming year.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Heather.